The Nile was a ribbon of obsidian, a slow-moving vein of shadow cutting through the pale expanse of the desert. Upon its western bank, where the land of the living met the realm of the dead, a figure stood in perfect stillness. Anubis. His form was a silhouette against the star-strewn sky. The sleek, pointed ears of the jackal atop his shoulders tilted not in alertness, but in profound listening. The moon, cold and full, silvered the edges of his form and painted the world in shades of bone and ash. He did not breathe, for he required no air. He did not blink, for his perception was not bound by mortal rhythm. Time, to Anubis, was not a river to be swum in, but a vast silent desert through which all things eventually drifted. He perceived its flow not as a sequence of moments, but as a single endless tapestry. Within the warm night breeze that carried the scent of lotus and distant myrrh, he felt the whispers. They were not cries, nor pleas, but the soft, indelible echoes of every soul that had been, that was, and that ever would be drawn into his care. A pharaoh entombed in granite, a child laid to rest in a woven basket, a soldier fallen on distant sand. Their essences lingered in the air like perfume, a chorus of transitions awaiting his guidance. Before him, the sands of the necropolis shifted with an infinite patience that mirrored his own. A grain tumbled down a dune, a process that had begun at the dawn of the world and would continue until its end. The silence here was not an absence, but a presence. It was the silence of watchfulness, of a vigil so complete it became the fabric of the place. The waters of the Nile did not chatter. They flowed with a hushed, purposeful murmur, carrying the reflections of stars on their dark surface, stars that were the unblinking eyes of the netherworld. His role was not one of action, but of being. He was the guardian of the threshold, the weigher of truths, the preparer of vessels for the long journey. In this moonlit stillness, he observed the entirety of his purpose. The sands represented eternity itself, shifting yet constant, varying yet preserving. The river was the journey, the inevitable, ceaseless current from one state of being to the next. And he, Anubis, was the fixed point upon the shore, the silent witness to whom all these currents and grains eventually spoke. He felt the pull of souls yet to depart their flesh, a gentle tug in the cosmic weave. He sensed the peaceful rest of those he had safely conducted, their silence a different note in the eternal hymn. His stillness was active, a gravitational force of order, Ma'at, around which the chaos of mortality and fear inevitably calmed. He did not rule the dead, he shepherded them. He did not judge their hearts. He prepared the scales so their own lives could speak. A shooting star traced a brief, fiery line across the dome of the sky and vanished. A mortal might make a wish upon it. Anubis saw only the brief, beautiful arc of a single point of light returning to the great, dark weave, a metaphor understood by his timeless mind. All things returned. All journeys ended at a shore he guarded. The desert breeze sighed again, cooler now, as the night deepened toward its own invisible nadir. The whispers within it grew momentarily clearer, the confused murmur of a soul newly loosened from its anchor, far to the north. It was a call he would answer, not with haste, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of the tide. There was no urgency in eternity, only perfect, patient readiness. He remained, a statue of divine watchfulness. The sands continued their slow, silent dance. The Nile flowed on, a dark mirror to the Milky Way stretching above. Here, on the sands of eternity, Anubis stood and waited and watched. His vigil was the world's oldest promise, that no one would make the final journey alone. and that silence, in the end, was not emptiness, but peace. The whisper was a filament of disquiet, a silken thread of confusion pulled taut across the silent loom of the night. It originated not from the grand necropolis, but from a modest villa on the river's edge, where the scent of papyrus and dried ink still clung to the air. Anubis turned his head, a motion as slow and inevitable as the turning of the celestial sphere. His perception, which held the echoes of all souls, focused upon this single newly unraveled thread. He did not travel as mortals understood it. The distance between the western bank and the villa simply ceased to be. One moment he was a silhouette against the stars. The next he stood within a room hushed by death. The body of a scribe lay upon a simple pallet, hands crossed over a chest that no longer rose or fell. The soul, however, hovered nearby, a shimmer of pale light, formless and agitated, like mist disturbed by a sudden breath. The soul knew it was no longer within the flesh, yet it clung to the familiar contours of the room. It fluttered towards the papyrus scrolls left unfurled on a low table, towards the reed pens, towards the faint lingering warmth of the oil lamp. It was a bird beating its wings against a cage it could not see, trapped by memory and the terror of the unknown. Confusion radiated from it in silent, panicked waves. Anubis approached. His footfall made no sound upon the packed earth floor. He did not announce himself with words, for words were tools of the living, bound to tongues and breath. His communication was one of essence, of presence. He simply was, and in his being, he was an answer to the soul's wordless question. To the scribe's soul, the appearance of the jackal-headed god was not a shock, but a gradual dawning. The frantic shimmering began to still, drawn by the profound calm that emanated from the figure like coolness from deep water. Anubis extended no hand, made no gesture of summons. He merely stood, a pillar of silent assurance, his dark eyes holding not judgment, but an ancient, fathomless knowing. The soul's confusion did not vanish, but it transformed. The panic of a lost child softened into the tentative uncertainty of one standing at the threshold of a vast, dark doorway. It pulsed gently, moving slowly away from the scrolls, from the empty shell on the bed, towards the god. Anubis acknowledged this movement with the slightest inclination of his head. This was the first, most fragile acceptance. Then he turned and walked towards the wall of the room. He did not pass through it. The very air before him deepened, thickened, and became an aperture. Where there had been whitewashed mud brick, there was now the suggestion of a corridor, shadowy, immense, and silent. The first corridor of the duat. He stepped into that darkness, and the scribe's soul, with one last faint pulse of longing towards the world of ink and light, followed. The realm they entered was a landscape of echoes and twilight. The floor beneath was neither stone nor sand, but a substance that seemed to absorb all sound and light, yet provided a firm, unyielding path. The walls, if they were walls, receded into a gloom that was not empty, but pregnant with slow, patient potential. Far ahead, in a depth the mortal mind could not quantify, a faint sourceless glow hinted at unseen gates, at chambers of stillness and reckoning. The air was cool, scentless, and carried a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure, the silence of the deep earth, of the space between stars. The soul trembled, its light dimming with a fresh wave of trepidation. This was not the comforting dark of a night in the Nile Valley. This was the dark of the before, the dark from which the first mound of creation arose. Anubis, walking a few paces ahead, did not turn, but his presence, like a steady current in a still ocean, pulled the soul gently onward. He was the path made manifest. His very passage through the duat carved a channel of safety through the formless mystery. They walked for a time that had no measure. The corridor seemed to unfold endlessly, yet there was no fatigue, only the gradual shedding of weight. The soul's flickering memories of the villa, the feel of a reed pen, the sound of a spouse's voice, the taste of evening beer, began to soften, not forgotten, but placed gently aside like precious items stored for a journey. The confusion, which had been a sharp, jagged thing, smoothed into a quiet, wondering observation. Anubis was the perfect guide because he demanded nothing. He offered no false promises, no descriptions of wonders to come. His compassion lay in his impartiality. He offered only the journey itself, and his unwavering commitment to its sanctity. He was the midwife to this new existence, his duty not to hasten the birth, but to ensure it proceeded with a serene and holy slowness. The soul's fear was natural, a part of the transition, and he allowed it the space to feel it, to wear it out, until it dissolved into the cool, silent air of the duat. Eventually, the soul's light burned with a steadier, softer flame. It no longer lagged or trembled but floated alongside the god, a silent companion in the silent hall. The scribe's essence, freed from the immediate shock of severance, began to perceive the sacred order, the mayat, inherent in this shadowy procession. This was not an end, but a translation. The careful order he had kept in his records, the precise lines of hieratic script, found their cosmic echo in this deliberate, measured walk towards truth. A great shadowy archway loomed ahead, the first of many gates. Anubis paused before it. For the first time since the villa, he turned his jackal head to regard the soul fully. His eyes, pools of starless night, held a message not of speech but of profound acknowledgement. You are here. The journey is underway. You are safe. The soul pulsed once, a clear, warm ember of light in the gloom. The confusion was gone, replaced by a nascent, peaceful acceptance. The whisper had been heard, and answered not with a shout, but with a deeper, more enduring silence. Anubis turned back to the gate and passed beneath the arch. The scribe's soul, now a willing traveler, followed without hesitation into the deeper mysteries of the duat, leaving the last echoes of the living world far behind, soothed into oblivion by the god's patient, compassionate vigil. The Hall of Two Truths was not a place of grandeur, but of profound simplicity. Its vastness was defined by shadow, its architecture one of implication rather than stone. Columns of dark smoke rose into an unseen ceiling, and the floor was a surface of still black water, reflecting nothing. At its heart, upon an island of polished obsidian, stood the scales. They were ancient, their bronze arms darkened by eternity, yet they gleamed with a soft interior light as if lit from within by the concept of balance itself. Anubis stood beside them, a figure of stillness within stillness. The soul he had guided, the shimmering essence of the noble woman, waited a few paces away, a quiet, observant light. Her journey through the labyrinthine duat was complete. The final silent corridors had delivered her here, to the moment of truth. Anubis's role as guide was finished. Now he assumed his duty as the master of the scales. His movements were rituals in themselves, performed with a slowness that honored the gravity of the act. He extended a hand, not of flesh and bone, but of concentrated shadow and purpose. From the air beside him, he drew forth the woman's heart. It did not appear as a physical organ, but as a radiant, weighty gem, a condensed sphere of every deed, word, and intention from her lifetime. It pulsed with a soft, reddish-gold light, warm and alive with memory. It trembled slightly in his grasp, not with fear, but with the inherent vibration of a life fully lived. With infinite care, Anubis placed the heart upon the left pan of the scales. The bronze dish accepted it without a sound, settling under its spiritual weight. The arm of the scale dipped, a shallow, respectful bow. Then, from the fabric of the hall itself, he summoned the feather of Mayat. It materialized above the right pan, not a feather from any earthly bird, but a plume of pure, white light. It glowed with the serene, unchanging radiance of order, truth, justice, cosmic harmony. It was the absolute standard, the silent, perfect counterweight against which all mortal existence was measured. Anubis guided it down with a focused intent. It settled upon the empty dish, and the scale's arm rose to meet it. For a long moment, there was only the silence of the hall and the suspended balance. The two pans hovered, neither rising nor falling, held in a breathless equilibrium. Anubis did not watch the heart or the feather. He watched the space between them, the invisible point of tension where a life's truth met divine law. His entire being was an instrument of perception, calibrated to detect the most infinitesimal deviation. To his side, another presence manifested. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, emerged from the shadows. He held a palette and a reed stylus, his posture one of serene readiness. He was the recorder, the divine scribe who would inscribe the verdict into the eternal annals. He did not speak, but his presence acknowledged Anubis's primacy in this phase of the ritual. The judgment belonged to Osiris, the enthroned king who presided in the deeper shadows of the hall, a silent green-skinned witness. But the weighing was Anubis's sacred mechanics. The scales began their work. The heart, that repository of a human life, was not a static thing. Within its light, the echoes of actions played out. A moment of kindness to a servant, a harsh word spoken in anger, a prayer whispered in gratitude, an instance of quiet greed. Each memory, each moral choice had mass. As these echoes resonated, the left pan of the scale trembled. It sank almost imperceptibly with the weight of a petty jealousy, then rose fractionally as the memory of a charitable act shone brighter. It was a slow, rhythmic dance, a deep, cosmic breathing. Anubis observed it all with perfect impartiality. His compassion was for the process itself, for the soul's right to this ultimate clarity. He felt no satisfaction when the heart's light flared with virtue, no disapproval when it dimmed with fault. He was the guardian of this moment, ensuring its integrity was absolute. The calming presence he exuded was not personal reassurance, but the emanated peace of Ma'at, the certainty that here, in this hall, nothing was hidden, nothing was unfair, and the balance would find its own true level. The dance of the heart grew slower, its tremors subsiding. The pans ceased their minute adjustments. They hung, perfectly level, the radiant heart and the luminous feather in a state of flawless, silent balance. The noble woman's life, in its totality, had achieved harmony. It had not been a life without fault, but its essence, its core truth, was in alignment with cosmic order. Thoth's stylus moved across his palette. The sound was not a scratch, but a soft chime, like a distant bell. A hieroglyph of approval, of passage, was inscribed in light upon the air, and then faded into the permanent record of the divine. From the depths of the hall, a sense of acknowledgement flowed from the presence of Osiris, a verdict of true voice. Anubis, his task complete, reached out. With the same deliberate care, He lifted the now quiescent heart from its pan. The feather of Mayat dissolved back into the atmosphere of the hall. The scales stood empty, ready, eternally patient for the next soul. He turned and offered the heart back to the noble woman's soul. It floated towards her, not to be reclaimed, but to be witnessed. Her own truth returned to her, validated. Her light brightened, suffused with a deep, quiet joy and the relief of understanding. The fear of judgment was gone, replaced by the peace of truth acknowledged. Without a word, Anubis gestured with his gaze towards a new archway that had formed in the shadows, from which a gentle, golden light emanated, the path to the field of reeds. His role was over. He had prepared the scales, overseen the weighing, and preserved the sanctity of the ritual. He was the keeper of the balance, a silent, impartial guardian ensuring that every heart, from pharaoh to farmer, received the same perfect, patient measure. The soul, now assured, moved past him towards the golden light. Anubis watched her go, then turned his attention back to the empty scales. In the stillness of the Hall of Two Truths, he waited. Another whisper would come, another soul would need guiding, and the scales, like the god who tended them, were forever ready. The tomb was a wound in the earth, freshly sutured by stone and sealed by sacred utterance. Deep within the limestone ribs of the Valley of the Kings, behind a doorway now hidden by a carefully arranged scree of rock, silence had been installed like a final precious offering. The air was cool and still, heavy with the scent of dried resin, cedar oil, and the profound absence of life. Paintings on the chamber walls, vivid depictions of the deceased's journey through the duat, lay unseen in the perfect dark, their colors sleeping. Anubis stood in the burial chamber, a part of the darkness itself. His vigil was not a patrol, but a state of being. He had been present at the sealing, a silent witness to the priest's chants and the final roll of the blocking stone. His role now was one of integration. He did not guard the tomb from without. He became its innermost atmosphere, its eternal sentinel. His consciousness permeated the still air, the painted plaster, the very sarcophagus that held the mummified king. He was the promise made manifest. This sleep would not be disturbed. Time, in the sealed dark, was a meaningless concept. Anubis perceived it only as the gradual deepening of silence, the settling of dust, the slow geological patience of the mountain above. The king's ka rested peacefully within the bandaged form, already beginning its dreamlike journey towards the halls of judgment, guided by the god's pervasive, unseen presence. Then a vibration, not a sound, but a disturbance in the sacred stillness. A faint, gritty scratching from far above, beyond tons of rock. Mortal minds, fueled by greed and the desperate folly of the living, were at work. They picked at the mountain skin, their tools biting into the night with a noise that was, to Anubis's senses, a blasphemous cacophony. He did not stir. No anger rose within him, for anger was a mortal fever. Instead, his watchfulness intensified. It focused, like a lens of pure, cold awareness, upon the point of intrusion. His power was not one of confrontation, but of emanation. He was the guardian, not the warrior. His defense was the aura of the tomb itself, magnified and made conscious. In the world above, 3 men labored by the faint, treacherous light of a shielded lamp. The air in their shallow pit was hot, gritty with dust. The leader's chisel struck a promising hollow sound. Hope, sharp and covetous, flared in their chests. They redoubled their efforts, heaving at a cracked slab of stone. And then, the silence changed. It was not that sound ceased. It was that the silence beneath them awoke. It rose through the layers of rock like cold water seeping upward. The stifling heat of the desert night vanished, replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the air. It was the chill of deep time, of the grave's intimate cold. The men paused, their breath pluming suddenly in the lamplight. The leader peered into the dark crack they had made. He expected a draft, perhaps the smell of ancient air. He received neither. He received a sensation, the overwhelming, paralyzing certainty of being observed. It was not the watchfulness of a man or an animal. It was the watchfulness of the dark itself, a sentient, patient attention focused upon them from the abyss below. The shadows in their pit, once mere absences of light, seemed to thicken, to coil with latent meaning. The painted eyes of forgotten gods in distant chambers seemed to turn, in unison, towards the disturbance. One of the younger men let out a choked gasp. The lamp in his hand flickered, not as if dying, but as if the light itself were afraid and wished to shrink away. The silence pressed in on their ears, a physical weight. It was a silence that listened. It absorbed the frantic hammering of their hearts, the rasp of their breath, and judged them not with wrath, but with a vast, dispassionate awe. This was not the fear of a beast in the dark. This was the soul-deep terror of profaning something eternally sacred, the dread of a child who has shouted in a vast and holy cathedral and now feels the gaze of every saint in the towering windows. The leader's greed, a moment ago a burning coal, was extinguished. The hollow sound of the stone no longer promised gold, but a descent into a gaze from which there could be no return. This was not a treasure to be stolen. It was a sleep to be respected, guarded by a presence as ancient and implacable as the desert hills. "No," he whispered, the words swallowed by the hungry silence. "This is not for us." He dropped his chisel. The metallic clang on the rock was shockingly loud, a final vulgar insult. The sound seemed to hang in the thickened air before being absorbed into nothingness. It was the last noise they made. They fled, not from a monster, not from a threat of violence, but from the sheer, unbearable weight of sacred awe. They scrambled out of their pit, abandoning tools and lamp, their flight driven by a primal need to return to the world of the living, to the warmth of the sun and the comforting noise of mortal concerns. The silent, watching dark behind them was a realm they now understood they were not meant to enter. Below in the burial chamber, Anubis felt their departure. The vibration of their frantic retreat faded. The violation ceased. The profound stillness of the tomb, momentarily ruffled, settled once more. The chill in the air above would dissipate with the dawn. The mountain would forget the tiny scratching intrusion. His vigil continued, unchanged. He had not threatened, nor punished. He had merely been, fully, utterly present in his role as protector. By emanating the true essence of the tomb, its eternal sacred silence, he had allowed the robbers to judge themselves, to be overwhelmed by the reality of what they sought to violate. They had fled from the guardian's presence, which was the presence of death itself, not as an end, but as a solemn, inviolable peace. The cool air grew still again. The scent of cedar and resin reasserted itself. In the absolute dark, Anubis, the guardian of the necropolis, maintained his watch. The king's eternal rest remained unbroken, safeguarded not by force, but by the awe-inspiring power of perfect, silent guardianship. The tomb was not a treasury. It was a sanctuary, and he was its living, eternal vow of silence. The night in Sinopolis was a bowl of indigo, its rim the low, dark line of the desert. Within the city, all was hushed. the day's heat having bled away into the sand, leaving behind a cool, expectant quiet. But in the temple of Anubis, at the heart of the sleeping town, a different kind of silence was being cultivated, one that was active, resonant, and alive. Anubis stood in the innermost sanctuary, a space his physical form did not occupy, yet where his essence was most concentrated. He was not a statue upon the altar, though a black basalt image of him stood there, sleek and solemn. He was the atmosphere itself. The temple was not a house for him, but a conduit, a place where the world of breath and heartbeat strained to touch the realm of eternal stillness. 3 priests moved in the lamplight before the altar. They were old men, their faces lined with years of this same nightly service, their movements worn smooth by repetition. They did not perform for a congregation. They performed for the god, and in doing so, they maintained the bridge. Their ritual was the anchor that kept the sacred connection taut across the chasm between the living and the dead. The high priest, his head shaved and gleaming in the soft light, lifted a censer. From its pierced bronze bowl, a coil of smoke began to rise, not the gray smoke of common fire, but a rich, blue-white plume. It carried the scent of myrrh, bitter, sacred, and cleansing. The resinous perfume filled the sanctuary, a smell synonymous with preservation, with the sacred art of preparing the body for its long journey. To Anubis, the scent was more than an offering, it was an acknowledgement. It was the living world speaking the language of his domain, a sensory prayer that resonated with the core of his being. He absorbed it not as a mortal would smell a fragrance, but as the desert absorbs the first, rare rain, a deep, essential sustenance. The other 2 priests began to chant. Their voices were low, weathered by age and smoke, merging into a single, rhythmic murmur. They were not singing hymns of praise or supplication in the traditional sense. These were the hymns of the embalming ritual, the same chants that would be whispered over a body in the Pernefer, the house of beauty. The words spoke of purification, of the protection of the limbs, of the opening of the mouth for the afterlife. They were the sounds of transition, made here not for the dead, but for the living, to remind them of the order, the ma'at, inherent in the cycle they all shared. O Anubis, who is upon his mountain, preserver of the sacred body, guide on the paths of the beautiful West. The words, in their ancient rhythmic cadence, were like stones dropped into the still pool of the sanctuary's silence. They did not break the quiet. They created ripples within it, patterns of sound that expanded and then dissolved back into the watchful hush. Anubis listened. The chants were not directed at him. They were threads woven into the fabric of his eternal vigil. Each syllable was a point of contact, a tiny vibration along the connection between this oil-lit room and the star-lit deserts of the Duat. The oil lamps flickered, their flames casting long, dancing shadows that made the painted jackals and gods on the walls seem to stir with a slow, sleepy life. The light gleamed on the obsidian eyes of the statue, but Anubis's perception was not from that stone face. It was from the convergence of all these elements: the scent, the sound, the shimmering air, the focused intent of the priests. This ritual was a living echo of his own work. The myrrh mirrored his role as embalmer. The chants echoed his silent guidance. The flickering light reflected the fragile, beautiful flame of a single human soul against the vast dark. He reflected on the connection. The prayers of the living did not alter the fate of the dead. Osiris's judgment was immutable, the scales unforgiving in their precision. But these rituals, this devotion, served a different purpose. They wove a tapestry of remembrance and respect that comforted the living and honored the process of death itself. They affirmed that the journey was sacred, that the guardian was vigilant, that the silence which followed life was not a void to be feared, but a mystery to be approached with reverence. In this temple, the living practiced the acceptance he witnessed in the souls he guided. The high priest placed a small offering of lentils and cool water before the statue. It was symbolic, for the god required no sustenance. Yet the gesture was vital. It was an act of reciprocity, a humble gift acknowledging the immense, silent gift of his guardianship. Anubis received the intention, not the substance. It was another thread in the bridge. The chanting subsided, fading into a final whispered invocation that melted into the silence from which it had arisen. The priests knelt, foreheads touching the cool stone floor, and held their position in perfect stillness. The only sound was the soft hiss of the burning oil wicks and the distant muffled cry of a desert fox far beyond the temple walls. In this pooled quiet, the connection was at its strongest. The temple was no longer just a building of stone and paint. It was a node of focused consciousness, a place where the mortal world successfully touched the divine equilibrium. The peace of the dead, the serene, ordered peace of the field of reeds, and the silent corridors of the duat seemed to bleed into the room, a gentle, cooling balm. The priests, in their prostrate silence, were not worshippers in that moment, but participants. They were the living end of the bridge, holding their breath as they sensed the vast, calm presence on the other side. Anubis, his essence fully intertwined with the ritual's aftermath, felt the continuity. The cycle was unbroken. The soul guided yesterday, the heart weighed tomorrow, the tomb sealed last week, the mourner comforted in a future dawn. All were part of the same eternal process. This nightly ritual in Sinopolis was the heartbeat of that process in the world of men. It was a reaffirmation, a tuning of the mortal sphere to the cosmic frequency of Ma'at. The priests rose, their movements slow and stiff. They extinguished all but one lamp, the nightlight that would burn until dawn. They bowed once more to the silent statue and then filed out, their sandals whispering on the stone until the sound was swallowed by the temple corridor. Alone in the sanctuary, with the single flame making a tiny island of light in the ocean of dark, the atmosphere slowly shifted. The intense, focused connection softened into a general, pervasive watchfulness. The scent of myrrh lingered, a ghost of the ritual. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now, charged, deep, and full of the echo of devotion. Anubis remained. The temple was his in a way no physical location could be. It was a testament, built by human hands, to the understanding of the sacred transition he personified. Here, in this house of silence, the living nurtured the bridge of reverence, and he, the god of the dead, stood eternally at its other end, ensuring that for every prayer whispered in the flickering light, there was a corresponding everlasting peace in the dark. The Hall of Two Truths held its customary breathless silence. The black water of its floor lay still, mirroring nothing but the suggestion of towering shadowy forms in the gloom above. Upon the obsidian island, Anubis stood beside the scales, a figure of such profound stillness he seemed an extension of the apparatus itself. The air was cool and carried the faint, clean scent of ozone, as after a distant storm. Another soul had reached the end of the labyrinthine duat. This one did not shimmer with the refined light of nobility or the learned aura of a scribe. It glowed with a softer, steadier radiance, the essence of a man who had worked the black earth of the delta, whose hands had known the weight of a hoe and the feel of ripe grain. The farmer's soul waited, a quiet, humble sphere of light. There was no anxiety in its pulse, only a patient, earthy calm. Anubis turned his jackal head towards it, his dark eyes absorbing its simple luminance. His movements, as always, were rituals carved from time itself. He extended his hand, and from the soul's core he drew forth its heart. It appeared not as a glittering gem, but as a warm earthen orb, the color of sun-baked clay and rich, fertile soil. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, like embers in a well-tended hearth. Its weight in Anubis's grasp was solid, substantial, the weight of seasons and sunrises, of burdens borne without complaint. He cradled it for a moment, feeling the echoes within, not the grand dramas of court or the complexities of scrolls, but the steady rhythm of a life lived in harmony with the land. The memory of dawn breaking over flooded fields, the satisfaction of a straight furrow, the weariness in the bones at day's end, and the deep sleep that followed, the shared silence with a spouse, the laughter of children, the grief of a barren season accepted, the gratitude for a plentiful one. With infinite, deliberate care, Anubis placed the earthen heart upon the left pan of the scales. The bronze dish accepted it with a soft, almost inaudible chime. The arm dipped, acknowledging its substance. Then he summoned the feather of Myat. It descended upon the right pan, a plume of immaculate white light, the absolute standard of truth and cosmic order. Its serene glow contrasted with the heart's warm, humble radiance, yet did not outshine it. The scales hovered, beginning their ancient, meticulous work. Anubis watched the space between the pans, his entire being a sensor for balance. Thoth, the recorder, manifested nearby, stylus poised. Osiris, the presiding judge, was a green-skinned presence in the deeper shadows, silent and observant. The heart began its silent testimony. Within its warm light, scenes unfolded with a gentle clarity. There was no dramatic arc, only a tapestry of simple truths. A moment of sharing bread with a hungry traveler. The patient nursing of a sick ox. A harsh word bitten back in frustration. A small dishonesty, a handful of grain kept when it should have been given, its weight a tiny dark speck in the clay. But then the memory of returning that grain the next day with interest shone brighter, dissolving the speck. The heart did not tremble with passionate extremes. It shifted with the quiet, incremental adjustments of a man aligning his life with the unspoken rules of the land and community. It was the honesty of a measured yield, the justice of fair trade, the truth of sweat and sunrise. The scales responded. The left pan sank almost imperceptibly with the memory of a petty envy for a neighbor's larger plot, then rose just as slightly, with the genuine pleasure taken in that neighbor's good fortune. It was a dance of minor sins and quiet virtues, a life measured not in grand gestures, but in countless daily choices. Anubis observed with perfect impartiality. His compassion was for the process, for the soul's right to this ultimate accounting. Here, in this hall, the humble life of a farmer was given the same solemn attention as that of a pharaoh. The adjustments grew subtler, the tremors in the scale's arm fading. The dance of the heart slowed to a standstill. The warm earthen orb and the radiant white feather hung in a state of perfect, flawless equilibrium. The pans were level. The farmer's life in its unadorned totality had achieved a balance with Ma'at. His truth was not one of philosophical purity, but of practical integrity, a harmony with the natural and moral order as fundamental as the Nile's flood. Thoth's stylus moved. A soft chime-like note resonated through the hall as the verdict was inscribed. Ma Keru, true of voice. From the presence of Osiris flowed a wave of solemn acknowledgement. Anubis's task was complete. With the same deliberate care, he lifted the now quiescent heart from its pan. The feather of Mayat dissolved back into the ether. As he turned to return the heart to the soul, he offered a gesture of divine recognition. It was not a nod of the head, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the energy around him. A slight softening of the monumental stillness, a gentle exhalation in the hall's eternal breath. It was an acknowledgement of Ma'at fulfilled, a silent well done from the guardian of the balance to a life that had, simply and honestly, found its proper weight. The farmer's soul brightened, its warm light swelling with a profound, peaceful understanding. It was not the joy of triumph, but the deep, quiet relief of a task completed, a field left fallow and ready. The soul received back its validated truth. Anubis shifted his gaze. In the shadows of the hall, a new archway had formed. Beyond it, not the dazzling gold of a royal afterlife, but a gentle green gold luminescence spilled forth, the light of endless fertile fields under a perpetual gentle sun, the path to the field of reeds, a paradise mirroring the honest labors of a farmer's life. The soul, assured and at peace, moved past the silent god towards that welcoming light. Anubis watched it go, the humble essence fading into the promise of eternal verdance. Then he turned back to the empty scales. The hall's immense silence closed around the island once more, broken only by the soft imagined chime of perfect balance still hanging in the air. Here, in the heart's truth, the scales had spoken. They affirmed that the gateway to eternity was not forged from gold or power, but from the quiet dignity of a balanced life. Anubis, the impartial weigher, stood sentinel. He had borne witness to a truth as ancient as the Nile's silt, that greatness, in the eyes of eternity, could be found in the simplest, most honest of hearts. The threshold between worlds was not a line, but a breath. Anubis stood within it, one essence in two realms. Before him stretched the silent, starlit corridors of the Duat, where the judged souls drifted towards their rest like seeds on a slow wind. Behind him, though direction held little meaning here, pulsed the warm, noisy, fragrant world of the living, a world of heartbeats and hunger, laughter and tears. He was the pivot between them, the fulcrum upon which the great balance turned. His duty was not to one side or the other, but to the sacred transition that connected them. He turned his attention towards the living Nile, not with his feet, but with his perception. The river at midday was a ribbon of beaten gold, dazzling under the eye of Ra. Upon its western bank, the side of endings, a procession moved with a slow rhythmic grief. A funeral barge draped in simple linen was being towed towards a tomb cut into the bluffs. Mourners walked alongside on the pale sand, their forms shimmering in the heat haze. Their lamentations rose in a soft, wavering chorus, the sound of a heart being gently torn. Anubis drew closer, not as a manifest form, but as an infusion into the scene. He became the slight coolness in the blistering air that touched the brows of the weeping. He was the sudden, profound silence that fell between one wail and the next, a silence that felt like a held breath from the earth itself. He was the shadow cast by the sacred ibis that glided overhead, its passage a graceful, silent benediction. At the center of the grief was a woman, her hair dusted with ash, clutching the hem of her linen mantle. Her sorrow was a raw, open wound. She saw only the painted wooden coffin, the end of shared meals and whispered nights, the terrifying emptiness of the future. Her tears fell onto the hot sand and vanished instantly. Anubis stood beside her. She did not see the jackal-headed god, but she felt a shift. The crushing weight of her loneliness, for just a moment, lightened. It was as if the vast, uncaring sky suddenly leaned close and listened. The hysterical edge of her fear softened into a deep, weary ache. In her mind's eye, unbidden, came an image not of loss, but of cycle. The Nile's flood receding, leaving behind fertile black soil. The sun setting, not as a death, but as a promise of rest before renewal. She drew a shuddering breath, and this time the air felt clean, cool, as if drawn from the depths of a tomb, not the heat of a grave. He offered no words, no vision of an afterlife to come. His comfort was not in promise, but in presence. The presence of the natural order. He was the embodiment of the transition she witnessed. Her husband's body was traveling west, towards the setting sun, towards the necropolis, towards him. This was not a theft, but a delivery. The procession was not a march to an end, but part of a cosmic circuit as reliable as the river's flow. Her grief was the living expression of love, and love in this sacred geometry was the fuel that ensured the soul's journey was honored, not forgotten. He moved among the other mourners. To a young man stifling sobs, he was the firm, steady pressure on his shoulder, a feeling of ancestral strength that urged him to stand straight. To an old woman chanting a prayer through toothless gums, he was the sudden clarity of the ancient words on her tongue, their meaning resonating in her bones for the first time. Anubis did not take their grief. He framed it. He placed it within the vast, serene context of eternity, where it became not a meaningless sting, but a note in a hymn as old as time. The barge reached the tomb entrance. The priests began their final chants. As the coffin was lifted and carried inside, Anubis turned his gaze from the living to the threshold of the rock-cut chamber. Here, his presence intensified. For the soul of the deceased, now hovering near its physical shell in confusion, he was a beacon in the dark of the tomb's interior, a silent, waiting calm. For the living, he was the profound, peaceful stillness that emanated from the tomb's mouth, a stillness that felt less like emptiness and more like a door gently closing, not slamming shut. The widow placed a simple clay bowl of offerings, bread, dates, at the tomb's entrance. As she straightened, a gentle, inexplicable breeze stirred from within the dark doorway, carrying the scent of dry stone and ancient peace. It kissed her tear-streaked cheek. It was not a ghostly touch, but the breath of the transition itself. It was Anubis, acknowledging her love, affirming the rightness of the ritual, assuring her that the offering was received and the journey had begun in earnest. Her weeping subsided into quiet exhaustion. The sharp agony was blunted, wrapped in a layer of solemnity. She felt, though she could not have articulated it, connected, not just to her husband's memory, but to the river flowing beside her, to the sun journeying westward, to the countless generations who had stood on this same bank, performing the same duty of love. Her personal sorrow was absorbed into the communal, eternal act of returning a soul to the cycle. The tomb was sealed. The mourners turned away, their shadows long now as the sun dipped towards the horizon. Their steps were slower, heavier, but the frantic energy of panic was gone. They were participants in a mystery now, not victims of a tragedy. Anubis watched them go, his form once more dissolving into the ambient elements of the place. He lingered in the cooling air of the riverbank, in the first star that pricked the violet sky in the east, in the quiet lap of water against the reeds. He had walked between the worlds, not to interfere, but to affirm. His compassion was for the balance itself, for the living who must release, and the dead who must depart. By his subtle presence, he eased the friction between these two states, allowing the transition to occur with as much grace as the mortal realm could bear. On the water, the reflection of the evening star shimmered, a point of light in the darkening river. It was a perfect, silent metaphor. The star was in the heavens. Its reflection was in the Nile. Two worlds, separate yet connected, mirroring one another across an impossible divide. The living world and the realm of Osiris were like that. And he, Anubis, was the principle of reflection, the quiet truth that for every setting sun on the Nile, there was a corresponding rising light in the field of reeds. For every tear shed on the western bank, there was a measure of peace waiting in the silent halls beyond. The balance was maintained. The procession was over. The grief transmuted into sacred memory. The soul guided to the next stage of its journey. Anubis, his work at this juncture complete, let his awareness withdraw from the specific scene. The cosmic equilibrium, the ma'at of life and death, had been gently upheld, not by force, but by the simple, unwavering fact of his watchful presence at the point where all things meet their end, and where all endings are, themselves, a form of beginning. The high dune was a vantage point outside of time. Anubis stood upon its crest, the fine golden grains shifting imperceptibly beneath his feet, not in submission to wind, but in acknowledgement of his eternal weight. The desert stretched before him in every direction, an ocean of stillness under a sky dense with stars. The Nile was a distant dark thread, the life it carried now silent and sleeping. Here the world was reduced to its essence, sand and sky, silence and light, the unadorned bones of creation. He had returned to the beginning, but it was not the same. The serene observation of the first night was now deepened by the memory of countless journeys witnessed. The whispers he had once perceived as a distant chorus were now intimate echoes. The scribe's confusion yielding to acceptance, the noble woman's heart finding balance, the farmer's truth shining with humble light, the widow's grief softening into reverence. Each soul was a single grain in the dune upon which he stood, unique yet part of the whole, their individual passages contributing to the eternal sloping form. His vigilance was unending, but it was not a strain. It was his natural state, as natural as the desert's expanse or the stars' fixed courses. He watched over all souls, past, present, and future, not as a sentry awaiting an enemy, but as a shepherd aware of every sheep in a flock that stretched beyond the horizons of time. The pharaohs he had guided millennia ago rested in their golden fields. The souls he would guide 10,000 years hence already shimmered in the potentiality of the future, waiting for their moment to become a whisper on the breeze. In his perception, they were all equally present, all equally under his care. Time was a flat, illuminated plain, and he was the silent mountain at its center. The stars above were the clearest expression of this eternity. They were not merely lights. They were the unblinking eyes of the netherworld, the celestial counterpart to the dark, watchful silence he embodied. The Milky Way was a shimmering, ghostly echo of the Nile's path across the land, a heavenly river of souls flowing through the black vault. A meteor streaked, a soul's brief, brilliant passage from one state to another, and he noted its arc with the same quiet acknowledgement he gave a heart settling upon the scales. Below, the sands told the same story in a different language. They shifted in slow, rhythmic waves, driven by winds that had blown since before the first pyramid stone was cut. They buried and revealed, a constant, gentle process of renewal and concealment. To a mortal, it was emptiness. To Anubis, it was fullness, the perfect record. Every footprint of every creature that had ever crossed the desert was still here, not as an impression, but as part of the sand's eternal memory. Every tomb was here, every city that had crumbled to dust, every tear shed and every prayer whispered. The desert preserved all things by absorbing them, transforming them into the substance of eternity itself. He was the guardian of that memory, the silent witness to whom the sands eternally whispered their secrets. His silent promise was not one of intervention, but of order. Ma'at. It was the promise that the scales would always be true, that the feather would always glow with incorruptible light, that every soul would be met with the same impartial, patient attention. It was the promise that the transition from life to death was not a chaotic rupture, but a sacred, orderly process as dependable as the stars turning overhead. This promise was the source of the timeless peace that emanated from him. In a universe governed by such order, there could be no ultimate fear, only the gentle rhythm of change. The night deepened, the air grew cooler, carrying the scent of distant sleeping water and the mineral chill of deep space. Anubis did not move. His jackal head remained tilted, his ears receiving not sounds, but the steady hum of existence, the low resonant note of the cosmic balance he maintained. He saw the temple at Sinopolis in his mind's eye, the single lamp flickering before his statue, the priest's devotion a tiny bright pulse in the vastness. He felt the quiet integrity of tombs sealed under mountains, their silence a deep contented sigh. He perceived the peaceful progress of souls through the shadowy corridors of the Duat, moving like currents in a still dark ocean towards their destined rest. He was the anchor point for all of it. The living world, with its brief, bright passions, and the afterlife, with its endless, serene calm, met in him. He was the balance of worlds made manifest. His eternal watch was the guarantee that the bridge between them remained intact, sanctified, and open to all who would cross it with truth in their hearts. As the constellation of the jackal, his own celestial image, crested the eastern horizon, a profound, lulling stillness settled over the desert. It was a stillness that spoke of completion, of a cycle perfectly closed and instantly begun anew. The sands seemed to hold their breath. The stars pulsed with a gentle rhythmic light. Anubis, the god of the dead, remained upon the dune. His vigil was the world's oldest and most silent story. He watched over the past, a guardian of memory. He watched over the present, a guide for the newly departed. He watched over the future, a promise of order for souls yet unborn. In his watchfulness was the peace that passes all mortal understanding, the peace of the endless, gentle rhythm of eternity, where every end is a beginning, every silence is full, and no one is ever truly alone. The first faint hint of gray touched the eastern horizon, not the dawn of day, but the eternal dawn of the Duat. The watch continued. It would never cease. For as long as there was a heart to be weighed, a soul to be guided, or a tomb to be guarded, Anubis would be there. Upon the sands, under the stars, in the silence, eternal, patient, and utterly at peace.